Hello and welcome to the Recruit Rockstars podcast, where we focus on the people part of your growth stage company. Whether you're funded by VCs or private equity investors, you're in the right place because we focus on the people part of your business. And every Tuesday and Thursday, I interview a world-class expert on talent and recruiting so that you can build your company filled with rock stars. And today's no exception. I've tracked down the director of executive talent at one of the legendary venture capital firms out in Silicon Valley, San Francisco, and that's Redpoint Ventures. And my guest, Atli Thorkelsson, is the director of executive talent there. For a couple of years now, he's been working with all their founders. I mean, they have 80 portfolio companies. Redpoint's raised over $4 billion with a B, under management. And so he works with all these founders to help them develop a leadership team, recruit great people, and he's going to lend a ton of value to you. Before Redpoint, he was in headhunting. So just like me, he worked in executive search, found some of the biggest names in recruiting, in leadership. And so with all that, welcome to the show, Atli.
Thanks, Jeff. Thank you for having me.
It's great to have you on. I really appreciate you making the time. And, I'm curious, maybe that's a good place to start, is how do you go from being an executive recruiter to the world of venture capital? Maybe tell us a bit about that story.
Yeah, there's no one path into venture. I mean, I think everybody's pretty much aware of that. There's no one path into really any of the roles in venture. Specifically for talent, I mean, and specifically for my story, so when I was at SPMB, which is the firm I was at prior to joining Redpoint, I was working on a lot of similar companies to really what Redpoint's investment thesis was aligned with, and where they were spending a lot of their time, which was companies that were Redpoint's main fund is geared towards Series A's. We do have a growth fund that gears more towards B's and C's. That's kind of $20 to $25 million checks. But the main fund and the historical main fund of Redpoint is focused on Series A's. So that means that we have lots of companies in the Series B, Series C, maybe early D range, and dealing with a lot of the hiring challenges associated with those stages. And so coming out of SPMB, that was where I was working. The majority of my searches were largely geared towards go-to-market, largely geared towards searches for companies in those stages, with kind of a smattering of work outside of go-to-market and outside of enterprise and outside of those stages of companies. So I had
these were CEO searches or all kinds of functional leaders, the whole enchilada?
Yeah, functionally it was I'd say it was probably 60% go-to-market executives, so sales, marketing, customer success. I'll say, something on the order of the rest were some mix of product and engineering, and there were maybe 4 or 5 CEO searches across that time.
Okay.
And so, by extension of those companies being similar in foundational makeup to what Redpoint was investing in, a lot of them were Redpoint companies. So SPMB had an existing relationship with Redpoint, as well as a mentor of mine who helped Redpoint with a lot of this executive talent stuff prior to me joining. Him stepping aside was kind of the impetus for going to hire me. But people come into these roles from all different types of backgrounds. I'd say executive search probably being the most common, but in-house recruiters, people that are have had some talent bent to their background, but maybe weren't coming out of one of those two options. And then even the specific firm that they join is always, the path to that firm is always different.
Got it. Fantastic story of how you made the switch. And obviously you're loving VC, and I'm curious as we get into this, Atli, these things that you learn from these 80 portfolio companies. So what are the key things that you see? You see the same movie over and over, right? As these companies try to scale the people part of their business, what do they do right, and where do you see them go wrong?
Yeah. In as much as there can be a theme, and I hesitate to index too deeply on theme because each company is different, each challenge associated with each, hire, and for each founder, they genuinely are all different. I'd say in as much as there is a theme or a set of themes, I think that the things that a lot of founders do very well is that, especially first-time founders, as they go into these search processes of how do I hire my first CMO. What kind of interview questions do I ask a VP of customer success? The ones that do it well, and I think this is true for most of them, is that they go into it with a very learning first mindset. Having, they're not coming from this world. This is probably the first of this type of executive that they've hired.
Yep.
They come into it from a very learning first mindset. And also, the market shifts. Even if you did this search 5-6 years ago at a different company, it's a very different market, very different candidates. You're looking for different things in those candidates. So I'd say approaching it with a learning first mindset is super critical to the success of a search. Things that I think they tend to falter on, or that tend to stand in the way of a successful search. I'd say the biggest is, I'm not sure the right way to categorize this, but the right way to describe it. But being too hung up on the details, kind of having too, I don't want to say it's an unrealistic bar, because for a lot of these founders, they can hire very, very good people for incredible companies that they're building, but sometimes they can get lost in the minutia of why this candidate won't work, which is totally understandable.
What's an example of that minutia that you see them get so tripped up on? What would be a good example?
Yeah, it can be anything from one person in the interview process didn't jive with their personality, or didn't view them as a quote unquote culture fit, which in a lot of cases I would argue is a positive. Or they haven't operated in the exact right domain or industry or buyer group, or whatever it is. I think in the earliest stages, you have to index on potential a little bit. So with almost any candidate you hire, there's going to be some degree of a leap of faith. And when people get too caught up in those little things that make them not the perfect candidate, they're losing sight of the fact that every minute they don't have somebody in this seat is they're losing money, they're losing momentum against their competitors. There's a lot of things that they can lose sight of in the search of the perfect.
So looking
person.
for perfection, right? And no candidate is perfect. Part of your job, Atli, is to share with them what is predictive, what's not predictive. What have you learned over the years, both in executive search and venture capital, about what are the best predictors of how a candidate's going to do on the job, and the ones that they think are a good predictor but are actually not that good a predictor?
It's a big question. I think the things that are that are pretty consistently reliable are passion. I think obviously people perform best when they're dealing with problem sets that they're excited about. And if they're not excited about the market you're in, the stage of your company, the problem you're solving, that's big red flag number one.
Yep.
I think I tend to lean towards people that index high on potential. Maybe they haven't totally proven themselves. Maybe they're not that proven VP, but you can tell and you can suss out pretty quickly that they're a doer, and they're driving their career in the right direction, and you can catch them right at that upswing, right at that kind of hockey stick inflection point of their career, where they can be your first VP, and then they can have a very successful career after that.
So the up and comers, so to speak, as opposed to the proven thing.
Yeah, and that even the term up and comer suggests that they haven't necessarily done that much. And I think peeling back the layers a little bit on what projects have they been a part of, what things have they put in place themselves, maybe under a leader. Any leader is going to have lieutenants that's doing a lot of the heavy lifting themselves, and in some cases might even be so far removed from the tactics of it that they're not going to know how to do that in a Series A, Series B company when they don't have the budget to do that. And so even that term up and comer, I think, is a little bit of a misnomer, because most of these people have done tremendous things and made a really big impact. But the people that don't have that rubber stamp of VP or CMO or whatever it is,
so don't hire by title, I guess is kind of what you're saying, as a shortcut for the person. It's not indicative. What other things would you say leaders often look at that are not predictive?
I think there's a huge degree to which domain knowledge or, direct experience with, and this varies function by function, but direct experience with, a specific buyer group or a specific, subcategory of security software or something like that. People often start there, but, because they know that those people have directly competitive experience, maybe at a directly competitive company. I think there's a huge degree to which that's overblown. Even if it takes you, they could go through a 2-week crash course and be a total pro on that space.
Right.
The situations where it does matter, is, if you're a VP of sales selling into security, obviously you want to have a little bit of that, quote unquote Rolodex, and you want to understand how they think. But there's I think it's over indexed on.
How do you advise your portfolio companies to assess some of these things? So how do you assess passion? How do you assess potential? How do you assess whether the person can learn the domain if they don't already know it? Most interviews are not very good, right? I guess to be blunt, you did it for you do this for a living. But if you're a portfolio company CEO or a functional leader, this is not your job. You're not an expert at this. How do you teach them the questions to ask, and how do you assess that?
Yeah. Questions to ask typically is a little bit more straightforward. Just in that, you do want to go over the high level stuff. What was your budget? What was your head count? Stuff like that. So a lot of that stuff is pretty easy. But you're right on the point about interviews. I mean, interviews are if equal to their, if greater than, they're only slightly greater than basically a coin flip for whether this candidate is going to work in this role. Yep. But leaning on things that are a little bit more content driven, a little bit more substantive, having maybe an advisor of yours that has expertise in that function go through a lot of interviews these days do some sort of 30, 60, 90, but even a more specifically tactical or more in the weeds project that you're dealing with as a company right now,
right?
Having them come in and say, here's exactly how I would solve this real problem, not what's my overarching strategy, not what's the big picture, but how would I deal with this specific problem right now, and having somebody that has enough kind of functional understanding of what they should be doing to go through that can be impactful. As far as the passion piece, you just have to kind of poke and prod at it until you can get them to ideally open up. Like, why are you excited about this database company? Why does this matter to you?
Right.
And that's a particularly good interview for the founder to give, because most likely they share that passion or they have that passion.
So let's say it comes time to make the offer and the CEO favors candidate A. The venture capitalist, the board member, an expert like you who is tied to the investor, favors candidate B. How do you reconcile that? How do you get through that? Should you defer to the board member? Should the board member say, nope, it's your hire, here's my opinion, but you do what you want? Like, how do you I'm sure you've seen that before.
Yeah, no, that happens all the time. I mean, first and foremost, we're here to serve the founder, not the other way around. I mean, there's a kind of a thought sometimes that that we're kind of pulling the strings behind the scenes, and really, the goal of what we do, and certainly what we do on the platform team here, is we're here to be supporting resources. We're here to be advisors, but we're not at all here to try to make the decision for our founders. And they, even better than the board members that are in every call, me that is pretty well tied into the way that their talent development and their leadership team is growing and progressing, and the challenges that they're dealing with. We're not even coming close to understanding the actual problems of the company. And so the best thing that we can do is provide the right guidelines and frameworks around how they assess that question for themselves. But if it comes down to it, and me and the board member are in one camp on a candidate, and the founder is going for somebody else, if if everybody feels comfortable that they can make that decision, that the founder can make that decision, then it's a no-brainer.
You make the hire, you add the person to the team, and something smells wrong. How long does it take? How long do you give a new hire, Atli, before you say, I have made a mistake?
It depends on the function. I think you can tell pretty quickly whether a VP of engineering is going to be effective, whether they're meshing with the team, whether they're putting the right kind of processes in place. And this is odd because they have probably the shortest tenure of any leadership function, but it takes a lot longer for the things that a CMO is putting in place to really take root and create something meaningful for the company. And maybe that's 3 months for them to set up a demand generation pipeline and start to feed the sales org. But the work that they do around messaging and positioning and stuff like that, that's going to take 6 months to a year to even longer. And so it's you have to view it in that context. But once you're sure, pull the trigger as soon as possible and move on, because the cost of a bad hire is much higher than the cost of not having somebody. I think the cost of an okay hire is pretty basic. It's pretty comparative to not having somebody in place in a lot of ways. I think there's probably investors here that would feel differently and founders that would feel differently here, but a bad hire, you have to get them out as soon as possible.
The cost is immense. I am flabbergasted when people don't think about the cost to their culture, the cost to the rest of the team. You lose customers, you lose potential customers. It doesn't take much to really get yourself in trouble from one bad hire.
Yeah, and I think the biggest demonstration of that is the first people that are going to leave are going to be your top performers on that person's team.
That's right.
And those are the people that are really driving things day to day.
That's right. That's right. One last question, Atli, before we wrap up. What are some of the early warning signs that something is off in the culture of the company? So you get to 20 people or 100 people or whatever. How do you start to say, we've got a problem here?
It's a little bit of a tough question. There's always the situations where you're going to be blindsided by your employees coming forward and saying, hey, I'm not happy with this. But I think, I think people that are on the team of somebody that's not meshing, they're going to pick up on it pretty quickly. And especially in the early stages, you can have more of a dialogue with the individual contributors on your team. You can have more of a finger on the pulse of those people. But there should be, and a little bit of chicken and egg, but there should be a little bit of that culture of, if you feel like something's fishy, if you feel like, your boss is not steering you in the right direction, you should be able to voice it. And maybe you buckle down and do that anyway, but the CEO or the CTO or whoever is kind of running the show above that person, they should be receptive to hearing that feedback and not necessarily acting on it. But I think people have a pretty good nose for that, and if it becomes a theme, you better be listening.
Yep. Well, Atli, I can't thank you enough for making the time. You are very wise because you see this stuff all the time, over and over, both in search, now on the inside. Congratulations on your success and momentum with Redpoint Ventures. How can people learn more about Redpoint Ventures or get in touch?
Yeah, we are, feel free to visit our website, obviously, it's redpoint.com. Feel free to reach out to me, Atli, A-T-L-I, at redpoint.com. Worst case, I'm not going to respond to you, but I'm typically pretty responsive. And as far as learning more about Redpoint, there's plenty of content on the internet. Speak with people that have worked in our companies, whatever it is. We hope that our reputation amongst the people that we've touched and worked with speaks for itself, but we're always here to answer any questions and help guide that any way we can.
Great. Thanks again for making the time today.
Thanks so much, Jeff. Thanks for having me.